Well, thank you, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. And very interesting to hear about Jack Jeffery, and nice to have some of his family here today as well. Yeah, very, very happy to be in this wonderful historic town, Newcastle, to tell you something about this essay which we submitted with my wife, Hilary Cooper, and middle son, Ben Szreter, to the Institute of Public Policy Research. So they asked for they specifically asked for a radical plan for bringing about a step change in the quality and quantity of the UK's economic growth, which we found a very helpful challenge because the word radical meant that, well, there's a lot of license in that word. So we didn't have to worry too much about sort of boring things like, oh, it'll never happen, nobody's ever going to do that. We could get on with some thinking, some ideas. So our essay, Incentivising an Ethical Economics, was the joint first prize winner, and it set out our radical answer by drawing from economic history, economic and social history. So ethical economics, what do we mean by that? We think it's about mutual support and a collective state in future well-being. It requires a focus on the well-being of populations and how they share in success. And we looked to history for inspiration for how to do this. So what I'm presenting to you, what the essay presented, was a reconceptualization of the historic role of welfare. The conventional view, certainly among in the mainstream economics profession, is that welfare is a kind of a luxury. It's something that societies might choose to afford after economic growth, once they've become affluent and prosperous, and that most people think that's something that happened for many liberal democracies in the middle of the 20th century. The, of course, iconic figure here is William Beveridge, whose ideas were taken up by the first majority Labour administration after World War II, and indeed were very influential around the rest of the world. So the problem is that if welfare is a luxury, and if it's essentially a burden on the productive economy, something you can afford when you can, then it can be cut. And I think we've seen this for the last 10 years with the austerity policy, the idea that, well, we're just going to have to cut it. It's too bad. Yes, it's a great shame, but it's not essential. We've got to get the economy in order. We've got to make the economy more productive. We think that the lesson from history is that welfare is more correctly conceived as a growth promoter. Universal welfare provision in England even facilitated the origins of modern economic growth, let alone the continuation of it. So, the big surprise for people who are not early modern historians of England is that England was the first country in the world to have a system of universal social security and welfare provision, and I am not talking about Beveridge and the 1940s. I'm talking about 250 years earlier, and 450 years earlier, and 350, get my numbers right, and a good 200 years before anything that we can call an industrial revolution happens. So rather than welfare being something you get later, after you become wealthy, and then that's your big reward if you're a liberal democracy, we're saying if you properly investigate and understand English early modern history, it seems that a universal welfare system was there for 200 years, incubating our famous first industrial revolution. Now, I'm not going to read out all those names. This is just to make it absolutely clear that our essay is drawing on the wonderful work of many colleagues, many early modern historians who are specialists in this field. I've done very small amounts of research myself on certain aspects of what we'll hear, but mainly this is based on very important work, mostly during the last 30 years, completed by a range of historians, including some brand new work in the last 5 years that's come out and so on. And so what I'm saying, what I'm going to be telling you is based on their research, not primarily mine. So what was this system? It's the Elizabethan or Old Poor Law, as it's called. 2 key statutes for the relief of the poor, 1598 and 1601. These do not come out of the blue. They're not just some ministers dreaming up something in Whitehall, Westminster, the court of the Queen. The English crown has spent 6 decades since Henry VIII broke with Rome trying to work out something like this system. Because what happens with the break with Rome is that the Henry VIII famously dissolves the monasteries, he dissolves the chantries, he dissolves a whole load of institutions which were incredibly wealthy landowners. Probably a quarter of the land surface of England was in their hands. He sells it all off and then realises, got a bit of a problem here, because those institutions were providing they were corrupt in many ways, etc., but they were providing alms for the poor. And if you're a monarch in the early modern period, you do not want your nation to get unhappy about the vulnerabilities that occur to them in life regularly, particularly with harvest failure, which can produce difficulties. So it's actually urgent for the Crown, for the Protestant Crown, to work out some solution without bankrupting themselves with the costs. The solution they come up with is interesting and ingenious. The 10,000 parishes of England and Wales have ceased to owe allegiance to the papacy and to the Catholic clergy. They now owe allegiance directly to the Crown. The King is the supreme governor of the Church, or the Queen. So parishes, which have already been for a long time units of local religious worship, and now become the potential to become units of local government under direct control from the Crown. And this is what we see happening with the Poor Law. They are mandated by statute, so there's no way you can not do this, to establish funds for the poor in their parishes. The funds are raised by a progressive tax on the value of local land. Good, clever tax. You can't offshore land, you can't hide it. Whoever is occupying land, they have to pay proportional to the value of that land. It is spelled out who is to be supported all year round. Orphans, widows, the elderly, disabled, ill, and indeed the involuntarily unemployed. These are all to be supported. The statute basically says no subject of the Crown can be left by the wayside in any parish. They have to be supported. Justices of the Peace, an institution existing in England since the 13th century, are there to monitor the new office of Overseer of the Poor, which is actually a voluntary office. They collect the money, they disperse the money. But the Justices of the Peace are there to audit the accounts at the end of the year, and also to take appeals from individual parishioners. Somebody says, bloody Overseer won't give me my money. Look, I'm lame, I can't work. He says I can. They can go directly to the Justices of the Peace who live locally. This is accessible, local, free justice for the poor. So, the Old Poor Law is ultimately it's a set of 4 interlocking institutions of actually differing age. The Justices of the Peace go right back to the 13th century. The parish registers are created in the 1530s for different reasons, and they provide a record of where everybody is born, who they married, and when they died, which turns out to be quite helpful. The Poor Laws themselves, which we've just talked about in their mature form, the 1598-1601 Acts, and the settlement laws, which come into existence in the 1660s and are extremely important for solving a major problem. There are many practical problems that this system has to solve if it's not going to just break down and disintegrate and not work, of which one of the most obvious ones is you've effectively created 10,000 mini welfare states. And they don't want to be supporting other people's poor. And they want to make sure that their own people are paying in and that they're supporting their own poor, but they don't want others. So the Crown, by the 1660s, is really onto this, and they're passing statutes defining how to deal with this problem. And the way they solve this is to say that absolute entitlement that you have is fixed to one parish only. It's not the parish of your birth, it's the parish where your father's settlement is. Everybody has a settlement. Your settlement is where you have a right to claim relief. As a child, your settlement is your father's settlement. Often that is your place of birth, but that's not the formal definition of it. If you are a girl, once you marry, your settlement moves to your husband's settlement, his father's settlement. And one of the main ways we know that this system actually functioned, it wasn't just statutes designed in Westminster and signed off by the Crown and then totally ignored, is masses and masses of litigation which historians work through delightedly, parishes litigating against each other for individuals about this is yours, no, this one's yours. And this has left a lot of massive volume. It's probably, some historians have claimed it's probably the most lucrative source of income for the legal profession by the 18th century. All these parishes kind of, cross-litigating and so on. But the system probably would have broken down completely because of this problem, because England at this time, a lot of people don't realise, is actually a very mobile society. A lot of young adults move in this society. It probably would have broken down completely if the parish registers hadn't existed, because although you can settle things in law if you have to, the transaction costs of doing that are so enormous that the system probably would have just fallen apart under its own weight of its costs. But the parish registers are a way in which a lot of these disputes can be settled relatively quickly. When a widow says, my settlement is in your parish, and nobody in the parish has ever seen her because she married her husband somewhere else, but because he's now died, her settlement is there, and there she is with her 3 children, and the parish is saying, oh God, that's quite a lot of people to look after. Are you sure? And she can say, go and look at the marriage register. There I am, marrying the man from your parish. Elizabeth I, very interestingly, in 1598, very carefully, a new departure insists that all parish registers must now have a copy made in vellum volumes in the diocese of each for each parish, so that there is a second copy and a permanent record, because they know how important these documents are now going to be with this new system. So there's a lot of care. They've spent 6 decades working through, and there's a lot of false starts they make in that time, which we can't go into. But these summary acts reflect a lot of experience, and that's why they work so well. So, how do we know that this whole thing, I've talked about litigation. We have various official inquiries which also show us the scale of what's going on here. So 1696, we can calculate that 1% of national income is going in these transfer payments, which is what most of it was cash handed out to people whose families couldn't afford to live. By 1783-5, this has risen to 2% of national income, and we have another source that's telling us that about 11% of the entire population in a difficult year were using the poor law for relief. We also have research showing that the same family might be paying into the poor law because they've got some land that they're occupying, but later in the year, if somebody's got very ill or died, they're taking out of it. So this is not a straightforward system of the payers in and those who get something out and those who put something in. It's a system where you can be on both sides during the course of your life. And of course, because for most people, when they're old, they are going to be receivers of this system. So it's not a divisive us versus them system, it is an inclusive system. Very, very important evidence on the bottom line of this system. Again, this is very powerful evidence about the fact that it's really getting to where it's really supporting the very poor in their hour of need, is that uniquely in England we see no further correlation between burial records and grain prices after 1623-4, and that is unique in Western Europe. And nowhere else in Western Europe has a poor law system like England's, which operates in every little tiny parish to the far west of Cornwall, the northern borders, etc. So we've got some very powerful demographic evidence that this system is keeping people alive even in their most difficult circumstances, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. Then there is something really interesting that Elizabeth I does. This is one of the little bits of my contribution to this that other historians haven't quite noticed. In 1598 to 1601, she takes personally great interest in two acts which redefine charitable uses in England. Now, charities used to be, before the Reformation, there was a lot of charity going on. Catholic societies, Catholic institutions practiced charity, and they had quite a positive view of charity. Part of the Reformation change is that charity is no longer viewed as in quite such a positive light. It's associated with, in fact, with corruption and beggars, which are considered to be a thing that we want to get rid of in a good Protestant society. We create this good parish welfare system, and then we don't want to see beggars. That's a bad idea. So, at the end of her reign, Elizabeth is getting hold of this issue about what do we do with charity. We're very suspicious of the old forms of charity. Two new acts to really get hold of. A lot of charities also were extremely corrupt, one has to point out. So the Charitable Uses Acts lay down what you can form a charity for and how it's to be governed and what its uses are. They must be charitable, they can't be sort of for a cosy group to get hold of some endowment and then live off it forever. Has to be for the public good. And really interestingly, when you read the statute, it says that a charity must be formed to look after the ill, the disabled, the orphans, the poor. It's exactly the same set of people as the poor laws. There's only one thing extra, which is education. Schools for orphans and schools for the poor are legitimate charitable activities. That's not something that the poor laws mention. Though the poor laws do mention the possibility of putting children into apprenticeships, but they don't talk about schooling and education. So, what's going on here? Elizabeth is paying a lot of attention to first setting up a mandatory system that the wealthier section of society must support the poor in their community, and they have to pay it. And then she's got a set of charitable uses saying, on the other hand, if you want to form charitable institutions to support the poor, please go ahead. Use your ingenuity and your resources and do that. What's going on here is that Elizabeth is, through very clever policy architecture, she is crowding in voluntary philanthropic activity. She's not crowding it out, which is what a simplistic view of universal provision says, oh, well, everybody pays their taxes and then you don't have to do anything because the poor are all catered for. She's doing something very clever. She's saying to the wealthy and the prosperous in every parish, you have to pay for the poor. You've got no choice. You're going to have to do this. But if you want the kudos of being a good Christian, a good neighbour, a noble local family, and you want to build schools for the poor, you want to build almshouses for the elderly, go ahead and do it. And of course, the key point here is that if the more able, prosperous parts of the community really use their nous well, they can create institutions which are going to take the poor off their hands for the rest. They can get poor children skilled in apprenticeships, get them into schools and so on. These people are not going to be with them forever as the people that they have to support. They are also going to get noticed. I find it very hard to I go into lots and lots of churches all over the country, and provided the church was built by the 16th century or 17th century, which most of them are, I find it very hard to ever find a church that does not have at least one plaque on its walls, and often more than one, or on the almshouses that are often outside the church in the road, in the lane next to the parish church, saying how grateful the parishioners are for this family that gave X pounds for the poor, that gave the money for these almshouses, and so on. And a lot of this dates from immediately afterwards. The Latimer schools in London, the Charterhouse, the very famous big one in London, they're all founded within 10, 20, 30 years of this 1601 Charitable Uses Act. And by the 18th century, we're seeing hospitals founded, big institutions. So what Elizabeth I is doing is she's creating a welfare-minded society, a civic society of welfare, thinking, the wealthy section thinking about the poor, working on how do we actually really improve the lives of the poor, and make sure we're not just simply paying handouts to them for all of their lives. And it's an incredibly clever piece of policy architecture that she's come up with. It's also very economically productive. Universal entitlement to parish relief means that landholding is no longer the sole source of security. In most poor agrarian societies, the poor hang on to land for dear God, because it's the only thing they think that can give them some security in this world. The poor laws are creating a property for every single individual, a property, an entitlement to sustenance for your lifetime. You don't need land anymore as the final security. You've got it in your parish and the funds that it has. That means the older generation are provided for collectively, and it means the younger generation can leave. They don't have to worry what's going to happen to the older generation if I've gone off to London or somewhere else and so on. The parish is mandated to look after them, including healthcare. We now know from it was always obvious that that must be there, but Steve King's new book has documented a lot of healthcare developing. And certainly by the 18th century, every London, not every, large London parishes have workhouses with enormous infirmaries in them, hospitals basically in them. This release, this intergenerational security, releases the younger generation for rapid urbanisation, and that's exactly what an agrarian economy needs to be developed. The rate of urbanisation in England between 1600 and 1800 is off the scale compared to the rest of Europe. So this is a graph showing you from 1600 on the left to 1850 on the right. The line across the bottom is the proportion of the population urban in France, which just dawdles along at 10% for most of the time, and that stands in for most of Western Europe across these 2 centuries. The line across the top is Holland, the famous standout leader in the world in the 17th century golden age. Holland was absolutely streets ahead of every other society and economy. We copied all their agricultural practices in the part of the world I live in, Cambridge and the East Anglia, and Holland is a total leader. If you said to anybody in 1600 or 1700, a few decades from now, 100 years from now, there's going to be a country on the face of the planet that's doing things economically like you can't dream of, they would say, oh, well, that's obvious, it's Holland, I mean, that's, of course. But of course, what we know is it wasn't. It was England, because the third line on that graph, which is the one that your eye is attracted to, is the one that is showing enormous movement. It's coming from nowhere in the late 16th century, little country on the edge of Europe, to overtake the world leader by the early 19th century. The proportion of the population that is urban is the best measure we have of how economically productive and advanced an economy is becoming, because it's only by releasing population to the towns that you grow your economy. And to do that, your agricultural sector has to become more and more productive. And that's what's happening in England at this time. All this comes to a gear-crunching end in 1834, when we get the new Poor Law, a real change of ideology and practice in government after nearly a quarter of a millennium. The old Poor Law has been around for 236 years, and in 1834, the government, in response to new thinking, Adam Smith and Malthus, new political economy, classical economics, the original liberal economics, not neoliberal, Bentham and Chadwick, the utilitarians. Chadwick is the actual designer of the workhouses, and evangelical divines, Thomas Chalmers, probably the most important of them. They're coming at this from different angles, from economics, from jurisprudence, from religion, but they share in common what sociologists would call a methodological individualism. They think that the way forward is individualism, individual choice, individual price-taking, free markets, etc. All this stuff of the Poor Law and its collective provision looks like old ideas. This stuff of paying people to be unemployed, oh, that's mad, that's a distortion in the price of labour. We have to get rid of this. So we get the new, harshly deterrent system of the workhouse. The government doesn't completely abolish the Poor Law, but it says we're going to try and make sure people really don't want to use it. They're going to be desperate we're not going to stop supporting the poor in their hour of need, but they've got to be pretty poor. Of course, it produces enormous protest, and Dickens has, immortalised the cruelty of the regime in certain. Of course, not every workhouse master was like the one in Oliver Twist, and there was an immediate impact in the south, more gradual in the north. In the north, the Midlands and the north, industrial employers were well aware that workers often were put out of work by the trade cycle. And they did not like this idea that they should be put into the workhouse and treated almost like criminals because they were out of work. So the government could sell this policy in the south, but it took them longer to sell it in the north. And this shows that in the 18th century, 1% of national income was transferring cash to the poor, rising to 2% in the early 19th century. Doesn't sound like a lot to us today, but this was completely beyond anything else happening in the world at that time. 2% of national income going in cash transfers to the poor to keep them alive and help them. And sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. And here, 1834, dramatic cut in half of Poor Law expenditure, and then driven down through the rest of the century to as low as they can get it. So this is a government committed to laissez-faire, committed to the workhouse idea, and disinvesting in the social security of the poor. The impetus for growth is lost. We point out that 1873 to 1914, we had previously seen the English economy's productivity per worker rise and rise and rise, and it peaks between 1850 and 73. Then it declines. It gets overtaken by Germany and the USA, and historians are still arguing about why this could have happened. Why could the standout leader in the world have suddenly just gone into decline? We think that part of the reason for that is the disinvestment that began from 1834 in the security, the health, the welfare, and indeed the education of the lower classes. There was a dreadful famine in Ireland under this new poor law regime, which simply could not cope with such a scale of crop failure. And by the end of the Victorian era, the investigator Seabohm Rowntree, the ancestor of the Joseph Rowntree Trust founder, he finds that 30% of children are in poverty in around 1900. This is after a century and a half of economic growth. Workhouses, he also finds, are just full of old people who are ill. They've done their deterrence job all right. The only people using the poor law are just old and ill, and this is not really a good place for them to be. This produces the first significant repudiation in 2 generations of the principles of 1834. The new Liberal government, especially after the very poor performance of the British Army in the Boer War, starts to get fixated on the poor physical state of the working classes, noticing how many of them were rejected for recruitment. So we get school meals and medical inspections, that whole system to monitor the health of the population. Old age pensions, crucial change of tack from 1834. Now the older to get pensions in their hand out of the workhouse. They don't have to come into the workhouse for this. Bismarckian national insurance of health and unemployment for working men, and of course all of this costs money. Famous People's Budget of Lloyd George's 1909-10, the House of Lords, initially because it's progressive, this is progressive taxation coming back. The House of Lords don't like it, and 2 elections have to be fought in 1910, and Lloyd George wins. And that's when the House of Lords lost its power to veto a financial bill from the lower house. Had that set of legislation you're looking at not been passed, I hate to think what would have happened to the working class during the interwar decades, which were hard, particularly in the North and the Midlands. Unemployment was bad, but if that had been the old workhouse regime, it would have been it was a bad time, it would have been a terrible time. That sort of reversal of thinking becomes very different after World War II with the post-war Keynesian settlement, when we get a government committed to full employment, really important commitment, sanctioned by Keynesian economics. NHS, family allowances for mothers, free secondary education for all, not just elementary, but free secondary education for the whole population. Massive upsurge in the government spending on education. This is productivity of the nation. Rising, more than doubling from 2.7 to 6.4% of GDP across that period. The economy, of course, itself is growing. So this is an enormous change of heart by the government that we're going to invest in the future, in the growing generation. We're really going to invest in them. We're going to give their families security. They don't have to pay for their health bills. We're investing. What do we see? We have the famous golden age. Productivity growth is extraordinary in this period. It's not sufficiently recognised because it's not as high as in Japan and indeed even in Germany in this period. So people say, oh, why wasn't Britain's productivity even better? But the truth is, it's 3 times higher than the whole previous 60 years. So the productivity growth in this period was exceptional. 26 years of steady economic growth. Imagine if having that. Rising real wages for all. Because this was an economy with a government saying full employment, the real wage trend going up applies to everybody, not just to those in work. So, we've got 6 lessons from history, from our review of 450 years of history, showing 2 periods of big welfare investment associated with and producing good growth. 2 periods of government stepping out away from that and not such good growth. I haven't got time to summarise the 97 onwards period, the period under Thatcher onwards, but we'll talk about that a bit in a minute. Collective responsibility, guaranteeing freedom from insecurity, maximising labour mobility. Nowadays we would think of it in terms of maximising social mobility. Endorsing progressive taxation, the wealthier part of the nation buying in to this whole business. Incentivising long-term behaviours, locking in rewards and sanctions. So, neoliberalism to the financial crash. So we are going to talk momentarily about this final period. We have 2 million unemployed. It never falls below that. We know trade union powers were curtailed. It's the era of shareholder capitalism, deregulation and risk. And the need for this philosophy that the rich should share in collective welfare is challenged because Mrs. Thatcher cuts both corporation tax and top rate of income tax. The message is, you wealthy people, it's all right, you can just get on with your lives. You don't need to be paying excessively for the rest of society. The percentage of GDP spent on education falls by 1/3, and that there is no period in peacetime history which has seen a government of this country cut spending on education, which is the future growth and productivity of the country. And it's slashed by 1/3. Not a small cut, that's a big cut for 15 years, most of it occurring in the Thatcher period. Inevitably, with that change of philosophy, this is the Gini coefficient of inequality. This period here is the Thatcher administration, 80 to 90. The Gini coefficient showing that inequality of income, in this case, inequality of wealth would be similar, but actually, if anything, more extreme after a while. Benefit cuts, which we've had since 2010. We're now a country of 2,000 food banks. Interestingly, the UN rapporteur earlier in this year, Mr. Alston, describing the system in his own words as the digital workhouse, meaning what he was getting at was a system of sanctions and deterrence, why he was using that metaphor. Widening health inequalities, fall in the rate of increase in life expectancy. First, since 2010, we and the USA share the fact that our life expectancies are not increasing, even though they are everywhere else. Record employment, so that's often said, here's a good thing that we've actually got record employment, but it's alongside reduced investment. There's a lot of evidence that employers are just taking on cheap labour. They're not actually investing much in more highly productive end of the economy. Real wages have not returned to pre-crash levels, and productivity growth is averaging less than 0.5% a year since 2008. Golden age, 2.4% per annum. We've now had 10 or 11 years of 0.5% productivity growth. This is anemic. So we have a productivity puzzle. There's a long tail of productivity firms which lack diffusion of knowledge and innovations, it seems. There's a lack of investment by businesses to increase productivity. They just take on cheap labour. Brexit is helping not one bit with creating uncertainty. There's a loss of agglomeration effects. Infrastructure is inadequate. Transport congestion, long-term underfunding. There's a good study of Birmingham showing that it's failing to get agglomeration gains from the fact that it's a big connected city because its transport system is so poor. Inequality and expression in poor skills, health and poverty and anxiety, these all impact, inequality impacts on all of these, poor skills, health, poverty and anxiety. This, I think, is the worst, this is the most awful graph that I'm aware of. This is Mrs. Thatcher's monument. child poverty by the official definition rising by more than twice, from 15 to 34% during her period in office. New Labour, unfortunately, never really, that level of child poverty has become embedded in our society. It was running at 15% before, that has been cut back. Now, New Labour, mainly because of the minimum wage, they brought that down somewhat overall, but it's been going up in the initial years of austerity, and as you can see, the Institute for Fiscal Studies is projecting it on current policies to hit 36-37% in 2 years from now, which is just unconscionable for a wealthy society aspiring to raise its productivity and to compete against peers in the world, to be contemplating that 35% of its children can be growing up in poverty is just crazy. International Monetary Fund study 2014, a lot of research showing that inequality is not good for your economic growth for a variety of reasons. Reduces the durability to shocks, as we've seen with 2008. So what are the future economic challenges? We're not in a great place. And what are the future economic challenges? Decarbonisation. We've got to have decarbonisation. That's crucial, as Jack Jeffries would have been in the cheerleading for. Artificial intelligence will change the nature of work and jobs in unpredictable ways. And we've got population ageing. The costs of pension, healthcare and old age social care set to absorb increasing shares of public spending. This is, in quantitative terms, this is the one that frightens a lot of economists more than anything else. So, our radical plan that we put forward in this IPPR essay: generous and inclusive welfare provision is a crucial growth promoter. It's performed this function twice in our history, and when we abandon it, our productivity fails and society, of course, gets unhappy. Providing resources to support this, this is not a tax burden on the productive economy. It's something we should be doing because it's the growth seeds for our economy. Progressive taxation funded welfare in the past, and the wealthy saw that they benefited from it. Both the parish, the more prosperous in the parish, and after the World War II, people in this audience are old enough to remember that marginal tax rates on top incomes were above 80%. And so, and that lasted for 20 or 30 years. That wasn't like a kind of blip to do with World War II. So the whole period of the Golden Age, the wealth elite were paying 80% tax. It didn't stop the economy growing, and they weren't really moaning that much about it because they knew the whole nation had just fought a war of survival against fascism and needed a lot of investment. So our radical plan was to look back at the past and this idea of incentivized altruism. How can you incentivize altruistic behaviour with the right policy architecture, as we believe Elizabeth I managed to do with her Poor Law and Charitable Uses Act? So we want to translate this to Britain today. How can the wealthy be encouraged to provide the resources for growth, and how can they actually gain from it, rather than just seeing this as, I'm being presented with costs again. So that led us to propose two new altruistic contracts, each with specific incentives for those involved. Firstly, a new social contract, as we call it, a return initially to a higher level of corporation tax, not higher than other parts of the world, not higher than other OECD countries, the level of corporation tax that we had in 2008 when the financial crash struck, only 11 years ago. 28% is what it was at that point. Not high by OECD standards at all, in the middle. That will fund investment in upskilled an upskilled green economy. That's generate, to go to 28% corporation tax is generating, I think we calculate 28 billion a year. Investment in green technologies and green skills and zero carbon, all of this can be funded from that annual amount. We can also address the poverty and skills, and we can certainly look at regional renewal addressing inequalities. But tax reductions, the incentivization here is that tax reductions can be earned by the business community, the corporates, as targets, agreed targets for growth, decarbonisation and inequality are met. So every 2 years, having convened meetings of the corporates, government, the trade unions, local elected authorities together and agreed, where are we going as a nation? What is the decarbonisation we're going to achieve? What is the inequality we're going to do? How are we going to do something about regional inequality? After 2 years, if there's sufficient progress, you reward the corporations with a 2% drop in their corporation tax. If they go backwards, then you go back up again. But basically, Cameron talked about being against the something for nothing society, but his Chancellor has just given away 28 billion a year to the corporate sector. They've done nothing to earn it, nothing. This is about creating an incentivising system where they can earn their tax reductions. Greening the economy, a lot here. How long have I got before I should start talking? Sorry? Okay, greening the economy. So, public, a bunch of things. This is one area where I'll just give you a little bit more detail. I mean, there's a 20,000 word report, and so I'm giving you headlines, really. Public investment in research and development to develop green technologies and support zero carbon manufacturing. So that needs incentives to support technology adoption. Incentives in subsidies, there is cost there, at least up front. Creation of a zero emission vehicle infrastructure. We know that means, that's a lot of investment as well, so that people can use electric cars all over the country without it being a nuisance to them and wondering, how am I going to plan my journey and all this sort of thing. And also funding, some subsidies for the car manufacturers maybe. Significantly increased investments in renewable energy, particularly with combining with effective electricity storage. Very stupid of the government a few years ago to mess around with the solar technology panels. They subsidise them, then they de-subsidise them. Crap idea. That's just not the way to do things. Development of green construction, really important to have a very, very good look at geothermal technology for buildings. Any large building, we should really look at this. It is a no-brainer if it can be made to work. It's not easy, but it's the cleanest possible thing for an enormous amount of the energy that we use is heating our buildings. Large-scale targeted training for the green-collar jobs. This, how are we going to deal with AI and changing jobs? Well, we shouldn't be scared of AI and run away from it. We basically should be thinking about what are the new jobs and skills that go alongside AI that help us to get the benefit from it. And green-collar jobs could be a part of that. These are new areas which we can't even half describe at the moment, but we're going to have, if we're going to have a greener economy, we're going to have skilled workers to do it. So, another part of the new social contract is higher tax for earnings that exceed 10 times median earnings. So, in other words, if you currently earn more than 297,000 a year, you're going to be taxed 60% on the pounds that you earn above 297 a year. That's 10 times median earnings. And of course, the incentive there is, in a sense, as society's income earnings become more equal, less of the people pay these high rates of tax, either because the median increases its figure, or because people are actually just not so interested anymore in trying to crank up their bonuses and so on, because they're paying 60%, or for higher multiples like 20 times we would consider rates of 70 or 80%, which in order to try to bring society back together more, that's still giving plenty of scope for people to earn plenty of money. It's just that we're saying too much is not good for society's cohesion and for people to be in this together. So I talked about a new social contract, a new intergenerational contract to provide free care in old age based on need. That completes the welfare state. As well as an NHS, we get an NCS. We get a National Care Service integrated with the National Health Service. This would liberate older people from fears over care, over losing their house, etc. We know that there's once you reach 80 years old and above, you have about a 1 in 5 chance of getting dementia. Why wouldn't you want to insure why wouldn't the whole population want to join in insuring itself against this? That's worse odds than Russian roulette, 1 in 5. Why wouldn't people want to get involved in this? So we reform wealth and inheritance tax, exactly that section of the population that needs this care. We draw from them to pay for it, so that the younger generation doesn't pay for it in rising taxes, which is about the only other possibility, income taxes. The revenue should be ring-fenced in a citizens' wealth fund to guarantee long funding. So this is like a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have it. We're about one of the only advanced countries that does not have such a thing. You ring-fence it because you guarantee the long-term funding, you guarantee future political governments of different regimes don't start monkeying with it and drawing bits and pieces out of it and so on. You create it as an inviolate fund that is paying for this and this only. It enables younger generations to be mobile and take risks in order to progress in their lives. They know the parents are going to be properly cared for, high quality care, whatever their condition when they get older. As a young generation, you're not so concerned about staying close when your parents are getting weak or elderly and so on. So again, it's a matter of releasing the younger generation to be more mobile with what they need to do to earn a living and get good jobs. And it's releasing the elder generation from the fear or of feeling like a burden on their children, because they're getting cared for by this in this system properly. So we think that an ethical economics, which is what we're talking about, it reconceptualizes welfare as a source of transformational growth. It supports a genuine democracy where everyone shares in economic success. It needs political leadership to guide the economy towards long-term sustainable growth. It ensures short-term gains for some, those who are anally focused on their bonuses and their shareholder value, which justifies that, are not prioritised any longer. Long-term well-being for all and stakeholders, every company should be thinking of its stakeholders, not the bonuses of the CEO running it. And as Piketty has pointed out, if you can raise the higher progressive rates of tax, it actually starts to become less of interest to the CEO to be spending all their time working out how to jack up their own bonuses, because most of it's going to go in tax anyway. We need to replace Homo economicus, the abstract notion of a rational economic man operating outside of ethics, which is what economics works with. It's its fundamental premise. Ethical economics obviously has nothing to do with this and is an alternative to using that as your premise for your analysis. Quote from Samuel Bowles from his book The Moral Economy: if a policy has a public purpose that would be endorsed by citizens, make sure that the moral message is clear. Don't only produce public policies argued in cost-benefit terms, in economic terms. Make sure the moral purpose of what you're advocating is clear. Don't shy away from it. Future issues. How can we tackle the climate emergency? What should our measures of success be? We need to move away from GDP. GDP is taking us in unhelpful directions. We need measures that take into account sustainability and distributional measures that we're all being part of. These measures are a tyranny that impose performativity on us all, as Mariana Mazzucato has said in a great new book, The Value of Everything. Are free markets conducive for democracy? Radical free markets, unregulated? No, they're not. For the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a far too glib notion that free markets and free society are one and the same thing, because there's the same word in there, free. Unregulated free markets they generate oligarchies of wealth. And these extremely wealthy people, like the Koch brothers in the USA, use enormous amounts of money to infiltrate and lobby the political system and bend it towards their personal interests. So, as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, famous one, Louis Brandeis, said, we may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And with inequality and 40 years of rising inequality behind us in this country and USA, we have to look at this. It's a danger to our democracy. So the key messages are: history shows welfare is an important precursor to good economic growth. It's a growth promoter. Incentivized altruism can be created through the right policy architecture. It's not easy, but it can be done. It's been done before in our history to great effect. And we need to move away from so-called rational homo economicus and from conventional economic measures of success, like how fast the GDP figure is rising. And that's it.
Okay, so that was a real treat. I think we'll floor is open for questions.
Hello, thank you very much. I just wonder if you could say something about how we might even begin to implement any of this when we have such huge inequality levels now, as we saw on that, is it the Gini, what's it called, coefficient thing. And to put it bluntly, when people with a lot of money will continue to vote selfishly, I'm just wondering how we even would begin to implement any of this.
Well, I'm looking forward very much to seeing the Labour Party's manifesto. We've all got a chance. We've all got a choice, and we can run around and say, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, no, never, it's too radical for me, no. Or we can look at their policies, and we can think about what we want for the future. And the Tories will offer policies of spending on the healthcare and everything, and it won't happen. We all know that. They're not to be trusted an inch. The people who are running the campaign are, look at their biographies and what they do and who they've worked for. You trust these people, you're a fool. So, I think vote tactically, look at the manifestos, and vote tactically, and you may get possible. I may be very disappointed when I look at the Labour manifesto. I haven't seen it, but from the bits and pieces I've heard, it looks good. I think the Liberal Democrats will probably have an interesting manifesto. I think the Greens will, certainly. So I think what's really important in this election is to vote tactically, because I'm afraid there is no sincerity at all in what the Conservative Party are up to, and there hasn't been for a very long time. Their record speaks for themselves, you've seen it, and they're not changing.
We've got another question up here.
Following on from the last question, really, have any of the parties approached you, having, or on the basis of what you published? It's the time for their manifesto, so
Yeah.
you would think that they would.
No, we've had some contact, but not from their manifesto writing sections. We've had some bits of interest, but nothing direct.
So the gentleman here, and then that gentleman there. I'll keep around this side of the room as well, but I can't see anybody with a hand up just yet. There you go. But you first, and then you.
Thank you beyond measure for confirming the amateur conclusions I've drawn from 55 years of reading and observation, and though we may disagree, my Green Party membership, and answering my question about ethical, sustainable use of capital and ethical, sustainable growth. I hope you agree that fair trade is the good alternative to what's miscalled free trade. And can I end with a very brief comment? Correct me if I'm mistaken, but I was told that our distinguished Portuguese guest postponed because she was afraid of the reception she'd get today if we were leaving today, which my French surname and I find horrifying but unsurprising. And finally, could we see the 6 historical principles again so I can copy them all down?
So I can say that's definitely not true. So she is very busy, and that's what she can see. There was absolutely no mention of that particular case. I think she's a pretty tough cookie, and she could definitely take a bit of earache from the UK. We now have we've got 2 questions over there.
London buses on there.
And then sorry.
So thank you very much for the very inspiring presentation, and I can definitely, if I can ask a radical question, I definitely buy the concept. I think it's very nice, this incentivized altruism and the progressive taxation up to 70%, etc. But there is something that I just thought I cannot buy, and the idea that it would be better to have people unemployed than people on low wage. I mean, you can just see that naturally cannot be true, cannot work.
Yeah.
From the point of view of the person, so to say that it would be better to have a higher unemployment with people on benefit and employment on benefit rather than cheap labor, it just cannot be true, can you?
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I don't think I'm arguing for that. I only mentioned, I think, the 1 point the minimum wage, and I was talking about how that had seemed that probably the main reason why child poverty had reduced in the under the new Labour regime. And so I think that a minimum wage has proven itself once as an extremely effective policy. Patrick Minford, the sort of darling of the neoliberals, famously had a hissy fit about it and said it was just going to be a waste. He's had to eat humble pie on that one because it's worked very well. It's an extremely good discipline for employers. It means that they have to think very carefully about their production system and who they're employing, and whether they should be looking around for better organisational patterns, for better machinery, better kinds of investment and so on, and working hard on their markets, instead of just being able to employ often very good workers at rock bottom wages. So I think I would use the minimum wage tool quite strongly, and that would bring up the level of benefits with it, so that even people who are out of work were having a good, a secure life to think what to do with themselves. I mean, the thing is not to fall for the Daily Mail story that everybody's a shirker and you pay them and they'll all end up, doing nothing. I mean, yes, there are some people who have chaotic lives, but this is not what you should base your policy around. Another thing we had in there, which I wasn't able to mention, is the idea that there should be a 3-year entitlement to free post-secondary education or training for every citizen, to be taken at the time of their choice in their lives. So in other words, some people would take it as university education in the conventional way, but some people might get to their 40s and 50s and say, actually, I'd like now to have 1 year of training or 2 years of training on this. The government will pay for it, and so they can train. So I think that there's a lot of things that one needs to put together, but certainly the idea of just paying people to be unemployed, no, that's not what we're after.
So we have a question here, and then we've got somebody up there, and then thank you.
Thank you for a massively cheery presentation. What I want to know is whether there's an online or printed copy of
Yes,
this.
perhaps I should have said that at the start. So if you go to the IPPR website, or you put into Google IPPR and probably my name, and certainly put Szreter and Cooper in, I think it'll take you straight to a PDF. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And so, gentleman over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk, which I thought was fantastic. Could you say something about your take on the current context and impact of globalization on trying to achieve something like this within a nation state? Does that make it in any way different to the two previous examples that you offered when welfare was introduced as a growth incentive?
Yeah, I'm as a historian, I'm very conscious of difference. We're in a different place. The analogies from the past are in order to give us imagination to think more widely. So if we're trying to deal with the current globalized situation, something that really needs to be looked at to tax companies like Amazon and so on, who will slip out of this 28% idea if they possibly can, is we've really got to tax their turnover. It's just, that's the thing that they can't hide and they can't offshore. In other words, whenever they sell anything, we tax them. In fact, I've had quite an imaginative sustainability idea that we should tax their packages. That every package should be taxed to reflect its cost to the environment. Obviously, taxed above that, in fact. And they find that quite hard to argue against, I think. So there are things that we could look at, for example, another problem with globalization. For once, we could learn something from the Americans, who tax every citizen, no matter where their earnings originate, all across the world. In order to be an American citizen, you have to accept this, and you have to pay on a consolidated tax rate on your total income, no matter where it originates. You can try and cheat that, but the IRS are not people to mess with. And that's another thing, that we've lost half of our tax inspectorate under George Osborne and his successors. This is nuts. Every single tax inspector brings in 6 times their salary in terms of compliance. So there's many things that we can do to think about the globalised economy that we work in, and to ensure that we deal with the kind of attempts to gain things and so on. It's a matter of will. We've had governments that aren't interested. If a government that sacks off its retires such a high proportion of its tax inspectorate is just interested in giving an EV ride to all their mates.
That was absolutely brilliant. I think the issue about the welfare getting in the way of growth, though, that concept is so endemic within the population. So you talk about, obviously, political parties and their manifestos, but you've got to change a whole mindset, I think, in a population which has grown up, I think, thinking that the two work against each other, welfare and growth. So the evidence you've got is very persuasive, but I'm just wondering, A, how we convince people, the general population, more about that, but also, are there things elsewhere? If we look at other countries, because obviously some of the examples you've got are looking at very different times, very different systems of wealth creation. Are you aware of other studies and work going on that show now how the two actually support each other, welfare and growth, rather than working against each other?
Well, yeah, I mean, most of our OECD peers are, I'm afraid, spending more than us. Not the Americans, they're the exception, but most of our peer economies are spending more on their public services, including, they don't necessarily have exactly the same kind of system that we have of the NHS, for instance, but as an overall package of what they're spending on their population, it's often above what we do. There's this sort of peculiar statistic about the NHS being, fantastically efficient. We get better health out of it per pound of revenue than almost any other system in the world. However, that's a double-handed statistic. It's also suggesting we're really exploiting it and not funding it as well as we ought to. And maybe we would get rather more out of it, especially in the last 10 years, when unfortunately life expectancies haven't been increasing.
So we've got a woman here, the gentleman there, and then a gentleman up there. So okay.
Hi. So I was just wondering, in terms of the National Care Service that you were referring to, and that there would be free provision for the elderly individuals who need it in our society. What about provision for disabled children who are in single-parent households, and those single parents are not able to access this care? What sort of provisions would you recommend for issues like that, or children who are again in single-parent households and their parent is disabled and they're acting as their full-time carer?
Yeah, I mean, can't claim to be any kind of specialist in that area, but the social contract that we envisaged with a larger flow of resources coming out of the corporate sector and from making our tax system more progressive, certainly those groups who have been most hard hit by austerity and its rather cruel measures in all sorts of ways, of bedroom tax and disability stuff, and the 5-week wait and all this terrible stuff. Yeah, I mean, all that should just go. That cruel stuff is just awful. And it's not got a place in a civilized country. And part of the answer, coming back to that previous question, is we have to be aware of the power of the press. In an unequal society, we have people who are very rich. I mean, there's plenty of very rich people who don't have this view, but unfortunately, you only need a small portion of them to decide that they want to own the media and tell people what to think, and it should be like them, or at least it should be stuff that supports their interests. That doesn't indict the entire sort of wealth elite of a country to say they're all like that. They are not. But unfortunately, you only need a small section, a very small section of them to decide that this is what they want to do with their wealth and so on. And you get a quote-unquote free press that is a joke, that is reflecting the views of a small minority. I've got a PhD student who's been working on British attitudes to taxation since World War II, and it's one of the findings is quite extraordinary. That I had thought, like everybody else, that most of the time since the Second World War, at least for a lot, especially more recently, most of the English population wanted lower taxes, and certainly since Margaret Thatcher, since 1979. But if you look at the British Household Survey, which is just an official annual survey, year after year, boringly going on, asking a sample of people about all kinds of things to do with their life, one of their questions is about tax. And every year for the last 35 years, there's only a tiny minority, a little line across the bottom, of people who want to pay less tax. Most of the population actually want to pay more tax most of the time, and there's a chunk in the middle who think it's about where it should be. And this entire business is the perpetration of our press. Our free press is making us all think that we all want to pay less tax. We don't. We never have done. But if they keep going long enough, we'll all believe that's who we are. This is, terrible stuff.
I've got a question here, then one there, then here. Okay.
So thank you very much for your talk. I'm afraid I was sort of 5 minutes late, so apologies if my question was completely covered by the first 5 minutes of the presentation. But, a lot of the great proposals that you're putting forward speak of the benefit to growth and the benefit to productivity. But then at the end, you sort of alluded to GDP as a kind of sort of a false idol and deeply problematic. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that conflict perhaps between fixation on GDP and your promotion through your measures of growth.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something we've certainly discussed amongst ourselves. We have to go with what we've got at the moment in terms of working up an evidence-based argument and case, and to present you with evidence that's remotely convincing, and certainly that the economics profession, this was a prize for economics, is going to take seriously. It has to draw on the measures that have been used for the last 40 or 50 years. So we use them, and we point out that even if you use them, it doesn't come out the way that mainstream economics thinks it comes out. However, at the end of the project, at the end of the essay, we come on board with people like Mariana Mazzucato and Diana Coyle and others many others now, who are arguing that we need really radically new measures to do anything, and we agree wholeheartedly with that. So, your question is absolutely right, but we have to, we would like to think this is an essay that is both using the obsolete measures against themselves and also saying that we should be doing something different, which is a large project in itself, and thankfully there are some very able people and very able institutions that are working on exactly this, and I'm hoping that they're going to be presenting, because this is, there's this, we as a society and as individuals, and certainly governments and electorates, respond to the dominant measures. And if if everybody's just told time after time that getting the GDP rate up is the crucial thing, we're all going to judge our politicians. We're going to judge, the politicians are going to judge themselves and so on by whether or not this is happening. And that's where we've been for a long time. We desperately need these alternative measures, no doubt about it.
Last question here, I think.
So, international trade is a very important part of any country's national income, and because you use that to fund these public benefits. And I'm just wondering, how do you see our inevitably evolving relationship with our European counterparts fit into this idea of collective responsibility?
I think that if Brexit goes ahead in any other way beyond a customs union, it'll degrade the capacity of the British economy to generate exports and to earn its way in the world. We'll have very slow growth for a very, very long time. Maybe that's not a bad thing. If we want sustainability, using up less resources. I mean, you know, coming back to this question about measures and so on, you know, why should we have growth? Why bother with growth? Why not distribute the wealth we have more equally and sod growth? Just make do with, you know, very, very, very modest growth. What's wrong with 0.1% per year growth? It's still growth. I think there is a problem with negative growth that I can see that generates complex problems. But a society that's comfortable with itself should be comfortable with extremely modest growth. Why is everybody chasing growth all the time? If you've got a very unequal society full of Hello magazine and celebrity stuff, you know, everybody's sort of thinking, oh yeah, I haven't quite got what I want, you know, I should be getting a bit more next year, you know, and all this stuff. That's what's driving it all. But you know, maybe we just, as a society, and maybe Brexit's going to have a golden lining. We're going to all just say, soft growth, you know, let's just all do more social stuff together and not worry about, you know, what kind of car is sitting in the drive and all that junk.
We've got about time to squeeze in one last question and then we're going to have to close.
Good evening. A lot of your policies are obviously talking about economics and they come through Parliament, so it's a political issue that politicians deal with the economics, and a lot of the policies that you're talking about are almost long-term issues like NHS or National Care Service. How do we deal with sort of with the political term only being 5 years? One party can come into power and do something, and then 5 years later the other party comes in and reverses all change. With stuff like decarbonisation, they're looking at 20, 30-year plans. But it's sort of counterintuitive the way it's working. How do we deal with that? Is that like devolution that helps with that? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting, there are some policies that governments have that tend not to be subject to the 5-year cycle. And this tends to be foreign policy, for example, or defence policy. So there are certain areas of government activity where succeeding governments of different persuasion do seem to think it's, you change at your peril. You think very carefully before you radically change the policy of the previous administration. So, it seems to me with climate change, we've got an issue like that. And an awful lot else can follow from taking climate change seriously, like this issue of settling for 0.1% growth, etc. So if we can look at the manifesto information that's going to be put in front of us over the next 6 weeks and think about and question politicians when you get the chance on, you know, how important to them is climate change and species extinction and so on, and you know, what is their long-term view on it and what implications do they see about it. I think this issue is got the potential for being the kind of thing that can forge a trans-governmental, trans-administration consensus. You know, we had I mean, after the Second World War, the Conservatives were in power from 1951 to 64. They didn't row back much on the post-war settlement in that period. So you can achieve, even though these were, you know, policies put in by a government they called socialist and so on, So we can see periods when, for whatever reason, you can have a trans-administration consensus on something, and I think this may be such an issue.
On that point, I would have to say thank you, a big thank you for a fantastic, very stimulating talk. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you come to our next Insight Lecture.